I'm going to do 10 minutes on Cicero or Cicero, depending on your pronunciation. Not because it's an integral part of the higher classical studies course. Certainly interesting background to have. Certainly useful to be able to understand how Cicero fits into our understanding of the period, but mostly I'm doing it because he is a personal hero of mine. Cicero lives on in the sense that we now have an adjective, Ciceronian. If somebody is very gifted, very eloquent with words, we can apply this adjective to them. So much courtroom rhetoric, a lot of the devices used in the courtroom. Cicero may not have been the first to use these particular methods and strategies, but his are amongst the first recorded ones, and certainly the ones which I've studied myself. The transcripts of the speeches against Verres and against Catiline and one of the murder trials, which I've just finished reading. They're just a joy to read, and they leap through 1,000 years. And as you're reading them, they're as fresh as they must have been when they were first written. By the way, his speeches were not always delivered. He certainly wrote them down for posterity because he was a man very much in tune with the idea of fame going forward. And some people find him irritating on that score. But he didn't always deliver the speeches in court for a number of reasons. So, for example, the speech against Verres, the second day of the trial, didn't happen because Verres knew that the game was up, and he sailed away to Marseille, I think, southern Monde, France. Anyway, moving on. He also left an enormous correspondence, letters to and from a number of people, but most significantly his friend Atticus. And through these exchanges of letters, yes, we get to look into the life of Cicero. We get to see the motives and the emotions driving this very interesting character in history. But he also reveals an enormous amount of what it was to live in that world. And without Cicero's correspondence, our understanding of the Roman world would be vastly different. He also provides us with a really human voice in the period. As I said, his emotions, sometimes they could be quite histrionic and over the top. But his enthusiasms, his joys, his successes, his failures, his depression, we get to see all of these things in a way that, for example, for Julius Caesar, yes, there are sources out there for Julius Caesar that we give us a sort of an insight into the man. But it's not nearly as revealing as what we have, the first-hand, the primary sources for Cicero are much, much richer. And finally, he lived an unbelievable life. To be a philosopher, orator, politician, lawyer, writer, soldier might be pushing it a bit, but he was certainly involved. To do all of those things, any of those things, to the degree of success that Cicero did, would be interesting. But he did all of those things during one of the most tumultuous periods of human history. He was an extraordinary human being. History may have made him that, but he is. Anyway, Cicero was not from the nobiles. He didn't come from an aristocratic family. He was, in Roman terms, a novus homo, a new man. And this was something, especially in his early days, that drove him. That he had to gain entry into a very closed shop. As mentioned previously, Roman politics was not open to those without money. So Cicero's success, especially his successes that drive him to his consulship, I think we have to see them as more impressive than anyone else who achieved the consulship at that time, because he had to do more to earn it. He had to be a more canny politician, to play different factions off one another, to curry favour with groups. And indeed, when he achieved the consulship, it was a close-run thing. Nobody in his family previously had held public office. It's a remarkable thing. I would say that the most important position he held in his early career was, I think it was a quaestor, aedile, quaestor. I'm not sure, one of those two, quaestor, I think, like a government financial officer in Sicily in 75 BCE. And he did the job really well, apparently. He didn't create a lot of resentment with the Sicilians to the extent, clearly they must have enjoyed him or liked him to some extent, because in, I think it was 70 BCE, I'm not clear on the date, the people of Sicily brought a prosecution against their governor, Verres, and essentially he had asset stripped Sicily, extorted vast amounts of money out of the population, and ultimately this is the crime that really did for him. He executed a Roman citizen in the town square. Of course, getting, the ordinary people of Sicily to bring a charge against Verres was going to be very, very difficult. Verres was very powerful, very rich, had a lot of very political friends. The closed shop of Roman politics wasn't about to bring a charge against Verres without considerable amount of dragging of feet. Nonetheless, Cicero, according to the novels by Robert Harris, he was kind of backed into a corner and kind of had to take the case. But whether he had to or didn't have to, the way he prosecuted it was remarkable, to the extent that Verres knew the way that the wind was blowing before the trial was over and absconded. He ran away. The transcripts of the speeches that Cicero intended to give against Verres are funny, sarcastic, well-informed, really just wonderful to read. And I really recommend that you have a look at least part of them, because they're so engaging. However, much as he prosecuted the case for the people of Sicily, he wasn't a popularist. He wasn't about to start speaking at the people's assemblies to get his work done. He believed very staunchly in the wisdom of the Senate. So he's kind of a contradiction in the sense that he didn't come from the establishment, but once he was there, he wanted to be part of the establishment. It wasn't about radical change of the Senate. However, he did want moderate change in the sense that he wanted the equites, a group of society that often gets translated as the knights, equus, horse. I spoke about this previously, how in Roman history the peasant farmers put down the plough and picked up a sword, but there was a group of society who were wealthy enough to buy a horse, and they became the cavalry. Equus is the Latin for horse, equites, literally the horsemen. That gets translated as knights, which is why on your chessboard, when you pick up the horse, you are picking up a knight. Anyway, Cicero wanted a degree more cooperation between the Senate and this group. Now, I think knights is misleading because it bestows a degree of aristocratic nobility or a reputation, which I'm not convinced of. However, if you were to look at the equites as successful businessmen, self-made men, people who were aspiring towards greater wealth and indeed succeeding in that venture, that's probably the equites. So not ordinary working men by any means, but not the aristocracy. Cicero called this cooperation the concord of the orders, harmony of these two groups of people. And in theory, that would allow more people to achieve position in the Senate like Cicero had done, from maybe not quite the same background as the existing Senate. It would dilute the dominance of those elite families, but it would also provide an injection of energy and fresh perspective as society changed. So, obviously, it's not the same as seeing ordinary Roman citizens suddenly elevated to the Senate, but it's a kind of a reform. The intention was there anyway. Cicero was consul in 63 BCE, and he exposed a coup, an attempt to overthrow the government by a nobleman called Catiline, a disgraced nobleman called Catiline. And he put down first of all, he investigated and exposed the coup, and then he had a number of the ringleaders executed. We're going to come back on that shortly. For discovering the coup and for his role in putting it down, he was actually given the title Pater Patriae, the father of the nation, literally the father of the fatherland. So he had the top position in Roman society, the consul, and he was given this extra honour, the father of the nation. It's not possible, really, to have a higher status in Roman society. It was as high up as he could possibly get. And it must have been a moment of extraordinary pride for this man who did not come from an aristocratic family to have that position. Anyway, in the putting down of the Catilinian conspiracy, he took the liberty of having a number of men executed without trial. This comes to be problematic because when the first triumvirate emerged between Julius Caesar, Pompey, and Crassus, Julius Caesar actually invited Cicero to become part of this ruling group, and Cicero declined because it would undermine the Senate. Anyway, when the triumvirate emerged, another character called Claudius Pulcher had a vendetta against Cicero, and Claudius became an ally of Julius Caesar, and Claudius managed to apply sufficient pressure, and Cicero was exiled from Rome, and he eventually took up residence in Greece for a number of years. The reason being, apparently, he had unconstitutionally executed Roman citizens. In his absence, his house was knocked down, and Claudius actually built a shrine to freedom on the site, suggesting that Cicero was some sort of tyrant. Cicero really hated the exile because he was away from Rome, he was away from political life, but his wife and his daughter stayed in Rome, and he loved his daughter, like dementedly loved his daughter. So being separated from his family, he fell into a depression. Now there's a quote on the screen that you can read for yourself, but it does give an indication of, yes, he was clearly very depressed and very distressed of being away from his family, but he also really laid it on thick. He had a capacity for self-pity, which can grate on, and does grate on some readers. He's in exile. I think we can excuse him. His somewhat floral expression of unhappiness. He was welcomed back to, his exile was overturned, and he did come back to Rome. In the Pompey versus Caesar civil war, Cicero sided with Pompey, which would appear to be a terrible move, but Julius Caesar understood the respect and the status that Cicero had. So at the end of that particular conflict, Caesar outwardly forgave Cicero everything, because to kill Cicero would be very much seen as the action of a tyrant. Later on, when Octavian and Antony were in conflict with each other, he sided with Octavian, which was fine. It gave Octavian, who was looking for a base of legitimacy, to have Cicero on your side, the former father of the country, the hero of the Catiline conspiracy. This was a really good thing to have on your side. However, Antony and Octavian reconciled when they formed the second triumvirate with Lepidus. And because Cicero had been quite vitriolic in his attack of Antony, he wrote a number of speeches against Antony called the Philippics. And Antony was burning with anger and hatred towards Cicero. So when Antony and Octavian reconciled, Antony insisted that in the proscriptions, these lists of men who it would not be illegal to kill, and indeed you could kill them and take all of their stuff, Antony insisted that Cicero's name would be on the list. Apparently Octavian fought this for 2 days before giving in. It's debatable, I suppose. Anyway, Cicero's name was added to the list of proscriptions. He was found and he was executed. The line attributed to him at his death is Ciceronian in that it's witty, it's pithy, there is nothing proper in what you are doing, soldier, but do try to kill me properly. It's a lovely turn of phrase. Whether he said it or not, we'll never know. Well, the hands that had written the Philippics, the speeches against Mark Antony, were cut off and they were nailed to the rostra, the speaking platform in the forum, along with his head. At Antony's instruction, because Antony wanted to show the world that if somebody writes something against him, he will have your hands. It's a very kind of bold symbol. But his wife, Fulvia, I think, went one better. And she apparently approached Cicero's head as it was on the rostra in the forum, pulled out his tongue and repeatedly stabbed it with a hairpin. If we take the same idea of symbolism, the tongue that had spoken out so vociferously against Mark Antony, she was having a revenge. Well, Cicero was still a very popular figure when he was proscribed, and apparently most people simply refused to tell the people who were hunting him, soldiers or mercenaries, they simply refused to say where he was. And indeed, when he was eventually caught, his own slaves did not give him away. His retinue, the people around him, clearly loved him because they didn't give him up. It was actually a freedman of his brother Quintus who actually gave his location away. So the people closest to him didn't betray him, but one of his brother's former slaves did. There is a nice, sort of a nice conclusion to this in that Cicero's son, Marcus Jr., was consul in 30 BCE. And if you imagine that the spread of news is quite slow across the Mediterranean at this time, the Battle of Actium, in which Antony's fleet was all but destroyed, that happened in 31 BCE, but the man who announced it to the Senate in 30 BC was Cicero's son Marcus. So there's a nice symmetry there that the Ciceros ultimately had their say on the Senate floor about Mark Antony. Why do I love Cicero? He is vain, egocentric, cowardly, pompous. Loves himself, self-pities himself, something ferociously. He is all of the worst things that you can imagine in a personality. Sometimes. He's also courageous, public-spirited, witty, energetic, prolific. He loves his country. He loves democracy. He had a strong sense of justice. All of these things. Sometimes. He was all these things. He was good and he was bad. He was unpredictable. He adapted to situations. He was a man of principle, but he bent with, shall we say, pragmatism. Some people would say it was cowardice. But I think all human beings have this in them. And I think that considering his circumstances, you would have to be all those things. And if he had just left us the books that he wrote as philosophical books, it would be a key period from Roman history. If he had just left us his correspondence with Atticus, it would have been an amazing insight to the Roman world. If we only had his legal speeches, he would still be read and would still be influencing the way that courtroom delivery happens in the 21st century. If he had only been a politician, he would still be mentioned in the same breath as Julius Caesar, Mark Antony, Pompey Magnus, all these characters. But he was all of those things. And he lived through one of the most extraordinary periods in human history. And that's, for me, is a really big deal. He lived through it. Yes, he was proscribed at the end, but his name was on proscriptions in the past, and he managed to get out of it. He was in difficult situations. His career faced termination. He was exiled. He lived an unbelievable life. His foibles, his weaknesses, his humanness underpin it all. And much as many characters from the ancient world come out in 3D to us when we read them, I personally don't get the same sense of connection with another character certainly from the 1st century BCE like I do with Marcus Cicero. And that is why I love him.